Hi, we are on chapter 6. This lecture is going to be about crime and criminal justice. All right, first off, what the heck is a crime? These are different crimes currently in the books in 5 states. I just picked some. In Delaware, it's a misdemeanor to sell, barter, or offer the fur of a domestic dog or cat, so don't do that. California, a frog that dies during a frog jumping contest cannot be eaten. Florida, people who own bars, restaurants, and other places where liquor is sold may be fined up to $1,000 if they participate in or permit any contest of dwarf tossing. You have to wonder what was happening in these states for these laws to be on the books. Oregon, if you leave a container of urine or fecal matter on the side of the road, it's a Class A misdemeanor. Idaho, cannibalism is strictly prohibited and punishable by up to 14 years in prison unless there are life-threatening conditions as the only apparent means of survival. Crime is just a violation of the law, right? So if we didn't have these laws in place, you could be in California and eat a frog that died during a frog jumping contest without being punished. So really, a crime is just something that's going to happen because the law exists, right? And the crime, that act, violates the law itself. So only the law can define acts as crimes. Like many other things we've talked about, crime is culturally relative. Laws are going to differ from one society to another, or like I showed, it could differ from one state to another. And so determining what behaviors are criminal, it's a political process. So a good example of this is abortion. So abortion was illegal at the national level. Well, it was legal in the United States before 1937. Once Roe versus Wade was decided by the Supreme Court, it became legal. The Supreme Court could still reverse its decision. If it does so, it could become a crime again, right? So we were really thinking about what laws exist to make something a crime or not a crime. And then another question to ask then is, if laws are what's making something criminal, whose interests do the laws protect? So to remind you, power, which is being able to get what you want despite resistance, power is super significant in understanding crimes. So groups in society that have power are going to write laws that protect them, and they are going to make sure that they don't write laws that would harm them, right? That their actions would not be something punishable by law. Also, passing a law obviously does not eliminate a behavior, it just makes a behavior illegal. So in any society that's going to have laws or rules, there's always going to be people breaking those laws or rules, and so this is why we say that crime is universal. I'm going to start actually by talking about the different theoretical perspectives related to crime and the criminal justice system, which is, I just shortened it to CJ. So let's start with symbolic interactionism. And when I'm saying the criminal justice system, I'm talking about agencies that respond to crime. So police, courts, jails, prisons. Okay, so within symbolic interactionism, we know symbols affect our perception. And so this can influence how the criminal justice system treats people. So an example would be a person's social class, their reputation, their demeanor, right? A person might appear to be suspicious, but that would just be someone's perception of them, right? And so maybe symbols associated with it. So maybe it's clothing that they're wearing, colors of clothing that they're wearing, behaviors that they're exhibiting, demeanor. These would all be things that would influence our perception. And so if we are a police officer, right, that might influence how we're interpreting people just based on our perception of them. So fitting within symbolic interactionism, there's a classic study that was done by Chambliss in 1973 called The Saints and the Roughnecks. And what he did is he went into a high school and he compared different groups of boys in the school. He studied them. And what he came up with was there was pretty big differences between these particularly these two groups of boys, which he called the Saints, and then the other group was the Roughnecks. And this is 1973, okay? So work with me here. The Saints were the boys from the upper middle class white families, and the Roughnecks were the boys from the working class white families. And so the Saints, they were considered by teachers to be headed for success, even though they were some of the most delinquent boys in school, right? They caused the most trouble, they broke the most rules, but no one was ever arrested, right? Because these were boys from upper middle class families. The Roughnecks, they were considered troublemakers by their teachers, and they actually committed fewer criminal acts than the Saints did, but they were more often dealt with, like their behaviors were more often dealt with and punished by the police, right? So these were boys from working class families. So it's just a way to show, right, that the saints were doing more bad things or breaking more whatever the school rules they were breaking was. But they came from different backgrounds. So social class is important, reputation is important. And so we can see different styles of interaction from how they were handled by the administration and then the police or not the police. The visibility of each group and then how they were labeled affects how we treat people within our criminal justice system. So police discretion, which, right, police have discretion over kind of who they're going to consider. The more a suspect matches the officer's idea of a criminal, the more likely they are to arrest that person. So I will say, because of this, because we understand symbolic interactionism and interpretation, and that these are humans, right, in these positions, there should be a caution about crime statistics that you see, because we do have social class bias of law enforcement, which we saw. There's also racial bias of law enforcement. But we can see in the example that I talked to you about in the Saints and the Roughnecks, in that example, social class influenced the reactions of the authorities, right? They were both groups of white boys, but it was the social class that was different. So there are other things too. I mentioned race, religious affiliation is also important, nativity status, right? If someone's an immigrant or not an immigrant, these all can be biases that people have because people are the ones who are the actors in this criminal justice system, and so that can affect law enforcement. And because of this is all to say, this is going to affect who is going to show up in official statistics, which would be who was actually, sought after and or charged. That's who's going to show up in official statistics. So you need to make sure that we're cautious in thinking about the stats, right? So an example, when I talked earlier about cocaine use, well, people are in jail longer if they're using a certain form of cocaine. If they're using crack cocaine, right, that was more often used by lower class people and people of color. And so is it that, white people aren't using cocaine as much as people of color? Or is it that we are seeking those people out more, or they're prosecuted for longer, right? So crime statistics should be used with caution. Okay, from functionalism, crime is considered a natural part of society. And there's an innovation response. So crime is an innovation response to cultural goals that people seek, but they might use illegitimate reasons to reach that goal. And so this is usually where crime comes in. So this can be street crime or white collar crime, and you can read those examples there. But it could be that, let's say someone wants to have a car, but they don't have the means to buy a car, so they end up committing grand theft auto, right, to get the car. So it would be an innovative response. The goal is the car. They have to use illegitimate means to reach the goal, and then they would commit the crime. So in some ways, crime is functional for individuals and society, and I can show that here with this cartoon. So it's like a king and an accuser and the criminal and then whoever this guy is. But the accuser is saying, this man held up the bank. And then, maybe it's not the king, maybe it's a judge. He says, well, what do you have to say? And then the accused says, crime keeps more people working than the union. Because of me, you have thousands of policemen, lawyers, judges, prison guards, rehab centers, detectives, wardens, parole officers, and social workers. Not only that, we spend our money at your restaurants, resorts, and hotels. Lock me up and you doom the economy. All right, so it's a cartoon, but he's actually showing crime is functional for all those people who are working within the criminal justice system, and then even keeping the flow of money, right, in the economy, even though it's kind of flowing in different ways than it might have. So there are ways that crime is functional for society, if you're looking at it through this functionalist lens. From a conflict lens, conflict theory examines how the law comes down the hardest on the poor while providing leniency towards the wealthy. Again, coming back to that idea when I said that people in power are going to make sure that laws are written to protect them. So this is justice, Lady Justice, is depicted this way, right? She's supposed to be blind, and it's supposed to be unbiased, the law. But conflict theorists don't see the law as an institution that administers impartial or unbiased justice for people who are accused of crimes, right? So they say this isn't true. They also see the criminal justice system not as a system, but as a device. So it's a device that's used by powerful to keep them in their people who are powerful to keep them in their position. So the ruling class controls the criminal justice system, and then it's used to maintain its own privileged position within society. So, as an example, they say that police and courts, they don't harshly punish the owners of corporations. Instead, they focus their attention on the marginal working class. That's where most of our efforts are going. And the people that are owning these corporations, right, that might be committing laws, they are not usually persecuted or criminalized. And if they are, it's so mild compared to what we see being happening more brought down on the marginal working class. So power and social class then are related to the inequality, the social inequality that we see in the legal system. And I will give you an example that fits nicely with what conflict theorists are arguing. This is a screenshot of a report, but essentially this homeless man got 15 years in prison for stealing $100. So he robbed a Louisiana bank and he took an $100 bill. After feeling remorseful, he surrendered to police the next day, and the judge sentenced him 15 years in prison. In contrast, this story tells us of an ex-mortgage CEO, so a CEO of a mortgage company, he was sentenced to prison for $3 billion in fraud. So we have $100 versus $3 billion. What did he get? A 40-month sentence, which is slightly less than the 6-year term that was sought by federal prosecutors. So even people prosecuting him were only seeking 6 years for $3 billion in fraud. So these two men come from very different social classes, and we can also see how they are treated differently within our legal system. All right, let's go through different types of crime. I've got several of them. The first is juvenile delinquency. This is just going to be a crime that's committed by people who are under age 18, right? They're not yet adults. Many juvenile delinquents know that the crimes that they're committing are condemned in society, and they shouldn't be doing it, but many of them don't feel guilty about what they do. So some patterns of juvenile delinquency: 59%, about 60% of youth who are arrested never return to juvenile court. So it's good, right? So it happens once and then they're deterred. They are least likely to return to court if the first arrest was for underage drinking, running away, or shoplifting. So kind of more of these, quote, milder crimes, right? They're going to be less likely to go back to court. They're going to be more likely to return to court. So you can think about, like, returning to court is not good, right? So you get arrested or you get processed the first time, you don't want to go back to court, right? So we're going to talk about recidivism in a little while. So these juveniles are more likely to return to court if their first arrest was for burglary, truancy, motor vehicle theft, or robbery. So juveniles are more likely to continue that delinquent behavior and return to court if they are arrested a second time before age 16. So the crime that you're committing, the age at which you're committing the crime, this is all important in whether or not juveniles will be returning to court. Girls are also less likely than boys to be rearrested. So we also see patterns across gender. Okay, a different type of crime to focus on, juvenile delinquency. We've also got white-collar crime. So white-collar crime is crimes that are committed by executives and others in the corporate world. Usually the motivation behind these crimes is financial. So some examples of white-collar crime would be knowingly producing and selling dangerous vehicles, altering drug test data, creating false advertising, insider trading, or embezzlement. Those are just some examples. So some of these things might sound like it's not harming someone in the same way that, like, say, murder would, but white-collar crime is definitely not a victimless crime. So I'm going to give you some examples, and you can think about who the victims are in some of these examples. Okay, so there was listeria outbreaks. You might have heard about these if you're paying attention to the news, but one example is the company Sara Lee, who was producing, a Sara Lee factory was producing Ballpark Franks, right, hot dogs. And the company stopped testing for listeria in the meat, and 15 people who ate Sara Lee's infected hot dogs died from listeria. So you can think about the victims from that. And then how many executives do you think were sent to prison for life for these murders? Right? Was it even treated as murder? No, none. No executives were sent to prison. Um, no executives even received time in prison, 10 years, 15 years. Sara Lee pled guilty. They received 2 misdemeanors and they paid a fine. Okay, the Ford Pinto. This was 1973. Some of you might be familiar with this, but essentially, the top photo shows a 1973 Pinto. It exploded when it was tested by Ford. Okay, so before it was even put on the market, Ford knew that this could happen. At the bottom is a 1973 Ford Pinto, which was put out for people to purchase. And this is a picture after an accident in which 3 girls died after the Pinto was rear-ended. And so again, right, the Ford Motor Company is still going strong, right? Even though there was knowledge that the Pinto would cause death if it was hit in a certain way, but we do not treat these are white collar crimes. We see them differently as other crimes, right? And the people that are kind of those who should be held responsible, right? They get misdemeanor, they get fined, but they aren't going to prison in the same way for other types of crimes. Okay, another example of white collar crime is the Ponzi scheme. And so here's the man himself, Charles Ponzi, that it was named after. So a Ponzi scheme essentially is a payment of investment profits to clients, but you don't pay them from profits, you pay them from money that other clients invest. And so what first happened with the Ponzi scheme, if you've heard of this, it was in the 1920s. Essentially, Charles Ponzi got a large number of investments to buy discounted postage coupons. And then he went ahead and he amassed larger investments from even more investors. But instead of giving the initial investors money back, he paid them back from money from the second wave of investors. And so he was pocketing the real profits for himself and just paying one investor A off by investor B, paying investor B from investor C, and so keeping the profits actually for himself. So that's what's called a Ponzi scheme. Bernie Madoff ran a Ponzi scheme beginning in the 1970s, and then you might have heard of him because it was so big, this Ponzi scheme. So once the money began to thin out in the earlier 2000s, Madoff was unable to repay his investors, right? People might have started kind of taking notice. He had less people investing, and so his scheme started to fall apart. So then authorities began to investigate his business practices, and he was there. It resulted with 11 charges against him, 150 years in jail, and overall he stole about $800 million. And then Enron is another. So I'm sure you've heard of Enron. It was a Houston-based energy company. It was the 7th largest in the US at the time. And they used shell corporations to make up profits, and they kept millions of dollars of debt hidden. So by 2001, the company's complex system of lies unraveled. Enron found itself in debt that was in the billions. The stock plummeted. But of course, the stock didn't plummet before. The stock plummeted after the executives of the company stole millions of dollars while subsequently bankrupting Enron shareholders, its investors, and of course, people that worked for it then lost all of its jobs. Some high-level employees of Enron did serve prison time, but not all. So yeah, there's victims of white-collar crime. It can be complicated, so it can take time for people to figure out, like investigators to figure out exactly what's happening, because usually they're pretty sophisticated. Maybe not this first one, but they become more sophisticated. But definitely there are victims of white-collar crime. Okay, this is not an ad for watching the TV show How to Get Away with Murder, but my question is, how do you actually get away with murder? It would be helpful if you were a white-collar criminal, especially extra helpful if you're in the upper social class and you're an executive, right? Because you can produce hot dogs that you stop testing for listeria even though you were supposed to, and you can just plead to a misdemeanor even though 15 people were murdered, right? So compared with what we would call street criminals, when they are arrested, white-collar criminals are more likely to have their cases dismissed by the prosecutor, and they are less likely to have to put up bail, right? So they'll just let them go because they aren't seen as like a flight risk. If they are actually convicted, compared to street criminals, white-collar criminals are more likely to get probation rather than jail, and they're more likely to get a shorter sentence. All right, another type of crime, professional crime. Professional criminals consider crime to be their job, and they pride themselves actually on their skills and their successes. Usually they aren't worried about what they're doing as being a criminal act. They keep a regular schedule. They take time off for vacations, right? The crime that they're committing is part of it's their job. Examples of this are jewel thieves, um, counterfeiters, or people who are fences. So these are people who buy stolen goods for resale. If you've watched the Ocean's movies, you know about some of these people that are portrayed at least to be professional criminals. Okay, another type of crime is organized crime. So organized crime refers to criminals who are part of a larger network. It could be national or it could be international. What do you think the most famous organized crime group is? Sure, you've likely watched a TV show or movie about them. It's the mafia. So this group was organized in Sicily, so we're over in Italy. If you've seen The Godfather, you've watched something about mafia. So the mafia actually still flourishes today. And the reason it does is, and the reason it's so successful for how it's organized. And so these are some key points. So members of this group see each other as family and protect each other in that way, and they take vows of secrecy. It also has a bureaucracy where individuals are specialized into different criminal activities, right? So people have their own specialization. It also offers illegal services that are in high demand, so things like gambling and being loan sharks. It has political influence, and so it wields its influence through political corruption, and it also uses violence and intimidation to control its members and victims. So these are all things that contribute to the success of the mafia still flourishing today. Okay, those were the types of crimes. I want to talk for a little while then about the criminal justice system and some aspects of it. So first, plea bargaining. A plea bargain is when the state, so whoever is like prosecuting, whoever the prosecutor is, when the state offers a reduced sentence or a lesser charge in exchange for a guilty plea. So the key is the person who's accused has to say that yes, they did it, whether or not they did, if they want to take the plea bargain. So the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution guarantees your right to a speedy and public trial. So we all have the right to this, but if you know anything about the criminal justice system, you know that speedy is not the correct word to use. Almost all cases end with bargains made to avoid trials, right? So even though you're guaranteed a trial, most cases end with a plea bargain. And if you bargain out, you're not going to go to trial because you said, okay, I'm guilty. I'll say I'm guilty even if I don't think I am or I'm not because I want to take the lower sentence. Research on cases finds the following principles in the criminal justice system, meaning we're seeing this over and over. These are patterns. The poor spend months behind bars awaiting trial. Defense attorneys encourage plea bargaining whether or not the individual is guilty. So you have a right to an attorney, right? That's part of your Miranda rights. So your defense attorneys who you might be assigned to, they're actually going to encourage you to plea out. It's easier for them. They don't have to prepare for a trial. It'll be faster. It'll be better for their stats, right? Prosecutors use threats of longer sentences to get guilty pleas. So they might threaten and say, well, you're going to get, 10 years for this, where really they know the most they would be able to get is like 8. But you don't know that, right? Unless you're a lawyer or familiar with the law of that state. Judges dislike unnecessary trials, and so they might impose harsher sentences on those who want trials. Age, employment, and the number of previous arrests affect your own sentencing. And then the number of arrests influences the sentence regardless of how serious the charges were. So that's plea bargaining. Recidivism, which is something I mentioned earlier. So recidivism the rate is going to be the percentage of people released from prison who then are rearrested. So we often study the recidivism rate to see, well, what percentage of people that get out of prison end up getting rearrested? Because ideally, right, you wouldn't want someone who's in prison to go back to prison. They would have been punished, learned or changed or whatever you want to say, and then stay out of prison. But recidivism rates are not good. So within a year of release from prison, 43% of prisoners were rearrested. Within 3 years, 68% were rearrested, and about half ended up being back in prison. And so this data that's shown here, it also found that women rather than men, whites rather than Latinos and African Americans, and people 40 and older versus people 39 and younger are less likely to get in trouble with the law again after being a prisoner. So in terms of recidivism, research shows that people who have been in prison most often have a higher chance of going back to prison. And so it kind of makes sense because you're spending time in prison. Who are you spending your time with? Who are your socializing agents? All you do is spend years learning from the people that you're around, which is just other criminals. So you might spend years learning about crime from other criminals, right? Even though everyone's been caught, we're still putting people like in the same space where the socializing agents that you're with are other criminals, or at least other people have been put into prison. So what would happen instead if we spent money rehabilitating inmates? Would this prevent people from going back to prison again? Well, the current prison system fails to do this because prisons are socializing agents. I mentioned that for criminal behavior. And then upon release, all we do is send people back to the old environment that they were in without skills that will help them lead a life without crime. So we don't really have a great system to combat recidivism. And instead, there are some ways that you could argue we actually kind of encourage it to happen. Okay, also talking a little bit about the death penalty and social demographics of who we see this happening to more often. So race ethnicity is one of the social demographics that plays a role based on the numbers historically. The best predictor of whether a man would be sentenced to death in the US was knowing if the victim was white and the accused was black. And it was so historically known as a predictor that there was a Supreme Court case in 1972 that ruled that capital punishment was being applied in a discriminatory fashion, right? Like it was mentioned here, and that this was actually unconstitutional. So it was bad enough that the Supreme Court issued this Furman versus Georgia decision. Gender also plays a role. Since 1930, less than 1% of executed prisoners have been women. And then geography plays a large role. 18 states don't have the death penalty. And then of the states that do, which states have executed the most people? What do you think? I'll show you. So data from 1976 to 2016. So the blue states don't have the death penalty. States that have had executions but abolish the death penalty are the darker blue states. They do actually have a count associated with how many people they've executed in this time frame. Kansas has a death penalty but hasn't executed anyone. And then the green are states that have the death penalty and have executed people. Texas has the highest, 518, and then Oklahoma has the second highest with 111. But Texas has more people than Oklahoma. So if you actually divide out the number of people that have been executed by the population, Oklahoma has a higher, here I have it, has a higher rate essentially of execution. So Texas has the absolute largest number, but then the rate is a bit higher in Oklahoma. Okay. All right, so some social policies to be thinking about change in crime in the criminal justice system. First off, in order to have social policies that are going to build a society that is more just for everyone, we need several things. First, a fair administration of the law, right? So kind of coming at it from that conflict theorist perspective, but Lady Justice really should be blind. It should be the same protections that are given to one group should be given to other groups, right? So regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, social class, etc. But a big area of improvement is we need to reduce poverty. So poverty is highly linked to criminal activity. Education is an effective way that's been shown to reduce poverty. On average, the further that a person goes in school, the higher their education, the better job they can get, the higher their income level. And so they aren't going to be faced with some of these conditions that people are put into when they're in poverty that might lead them to commit crimes. In addition to trying to prevent crime, we can then have effective policies for handling criminals. And so I'll go through what some of the policies are within the current system that we have and some of those goals. So the first is retribution. So this is punishing criminals to show other potential criminals that you can't do this, it's not going to be tolerated, this is what's going to happen to you. And also within this restitution, so it can make offenders compensate their victims for the harm done. Deterrence is another kind of policy, so making people afraid of punishment so that they won't commit crime. But deterrence requires speedy trials, uniform sentences, and rational citizens that aren't going to just act on impulse in the moment. We don't really have speedy trials right now, so yeah, a crime might be committed, And then 2 years later, there's a trial and it's maybe publicized, and people are like, well, what was that crime even to begin with, right? So deterrence is kind of dependent on some of these things. Rehabilitation. So there are different programs, probation, furloughs, parole, halfway houses that can help with rehabilitation, but really the cost of successful rehabilitation, it's so much cheaper if we focus on rehabbing people rather than keeping them in prison. Prison is expensive, and we'll talk in class about if prison is so expensive, right? Why do we still have such high numbers of people in prison? And then incapacitation is like kind of the final goal. So this is removing offenders from society, or at least limiting their movement with ankle bracelets. And then capital punishment would also be obviously incapacitation. But we know that capital punishment really doesn't deter criminals because some states with the death penalty actually have higher rates of murder than states that don't have the death penalty. So those are some policies and goals. We are going to discuss the criminal justice system more in class. There's a lot to talk about. So this is kind of just like a highlight of what the chapter covered, but do make sure you read the chapter, and then we'll talk about this more together.